The economic development of South Korea over the past 40 years has to be considered something close to miraculous. When I first went to Korea in the late 1960s, the per capita gross domestic product was under $200. Now it is close to $20,000. When I first went to Korea in the late 1960s, except for Seoul and Busan and a couple of other cities, most people lived the same way that their ancestors had lived in the 18th or 19th centuries. Now if you go to Korea, you find an extremely sophisticated, highly urbanized industrial society where lifestyles have been radically transformed because of the urbanization and industrialization of Korea. So it's an amazing story, and one that I feel privileged to have witnessed over the past 40 years. The forces behind the kind of economic development in Korea are complex. Certainly one of the things that we have to take into consideration is nationalism. I recall hearing from many young people in Korea in the 1960s that Korea's tragic history of the late 19th and early 20th century was a result of Korea not being developed. And these people were determined that they would build their country's economy, develop their society, so that Korea would not become the victim of imperialist forces again. And so certainly that's a very important part of it. Another thing that we have to take into consideration is the leadership of the Korean government. From the 1960s on, the Korean government took a very active role in planning economic development and in coordinating economic activities. Whether that was good or bad depends perhaps upon your political standpoint, but there's no question that the Korean government played a very important role, particularly through its economic planning board of the 1960s and 1970s. The Korean government adopted an export-led development program to replace the old import substitution development program of the 1950s and early 1960s. In some ways this was modeled after Japan, because Japan had attained tremendous economic growth through this export-led development model. And of course the Koreans had, particularly the Korean leaders of that generation, people who were running Korea in the 1960s and 1970s, were people who had direct experience with Japanese model during the years of Japanese colonial rule. So, you know, the government-led export-led development model was a very important factor in Korean economic development. Another important factor was the Cold War regime. It is a fact that the United States during the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s gave favorable exporting conditions to countries like South Korea that were engaged in the Cold War standoff with the Soviet Union. The purpose, of course, on the part of the United States was to demonstrate the superiority of the market economy over the socialist economies of the Soviet bloc, including such countries as North Korea, as a direct contrast with South Korea. So there was, United States policy was an important factor behind that as well. We cannot overlook the vision and the daringness, the courage of many of South Korea's economic leaders. People like Jung Ju-young, the founder of Hyundai. He took tremendous risks in the 1960s and 1970s, and those risks paid off. And he's not the only one. Well, he's certainly a good example. At the same time, I think we cannot overlook the willingness of the people of South Korea to roll up their sleeves and to work really hard. Many times these people worked under very difficult, unfavorable conditions, and many times they were ruthlessly exploited by companies and by the South Korean government. But at the same time, they are also very willing, for the most part, to work very hard in order to improve both their personal standard of living and to strengthen the country. And that brings us back to the nationalism that I started off with. There is a real sense among the people of South Korea that they needed to develop their country, to bring it from the ranks of the underdeveloped countries, where it had been in the 1950s and 1960s, to the ranks of the advanced nations of the world. And they are now very close, perhaps, to joining the top economic powers in the world. Depending on how exchange rates go, the South Korean economy ranks anywhere from 10th to 11th or 12th in the world economy right now. So the determination of the people of South Korea to build a strong country has to be considered perhaps the most important factor of all in the Korean economic success story of the last 40 years.